Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. We're here with a special guest today, Dr. Jason Staples, and we're talking about his brand new book here, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism. And we had a great time reading this work, and this has gotten a phenomenal response from scholars around the world already. And I'm already going to tell you, this is just the first of more things to come. So we're very excited for this research. So Jason, before we dive into your content, let's say someone's maybe not familiar with you or your content. Can you give us a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, I guess. So I did my BA and my MA at Florida State, where I did a lot of language work and really got a strong foundation in early Judaism and classics, kind of combining classics work with a lot of early Judaism material and also some Hebrew Bible stuff. And then went from there to UNC, Chapel Hill, where I did my PhD and worked there again in early Judaism and early Christianity. And this research sort of grew out of a lot of that. The primary research that this grew out of actually came from my undergrad. There was an undergrad class when I was at Florida State back in 2003. It was a class on the Hebrew Bible prophets, and I noticed some things in there pertaining to promises to Israel and Judah, and the way that they actually, it was distinguishing between the two, and then took note of how those promises had been applied in the New Testament, and thought, that's interesting. There seems to be something here. And when I started digging through some scholarly stuff, because I got interested, I noticed that other folks hadn't really gone there. So it was like, I can fill this hole, and decided I'd just jump in and do that. And I figured, a decade or so towards this, and I'll get it done. And I can move on from there. And 2 decades in, I'm finally now coming out with some of the results of that. And, things always take twice as long as you expect, even when you kind of factor for that. So that's sort of the genesis of this and my background to a large extent, and where a lot of this is coming from.
Well, I actually love the idea of imagining someone who for 2 decades has been, letting this idea simmer and researching. I feel like this book is the opposite of a TikTok video. Now, I can't bash TikTok because we're on TikTok too, but you know what I mean? Like, it is just like, this is, I think, the epitome of what scholarship is and why it matters and will always matter. Is we need people who go deep, and that's not something that just happens by accident. So again, people will feel this throughout our conversation today. I mean, this is not an idea you just, I was up late last night and I was just thinking about something. It's this takes decades of time to really think through.
Yeah, it's excellent research. But on that note, maybe you could give us the TikTok version of your research, your book here. So, if you were to give us a shortened description, maybe of your book, of the research that you've done here, what would it be?
So if I was doing the TikTok version, it'd be like something like, you may think, and most scholars have thought through the modern period of research, that that Israel, when people talk about Israel in the Bible or in the period after the Bible, that when people say Israel, they mean the Jews. That is synonymous with the people that in Greek would be called the Yehudaioi, or in Hebrew the Yehudim, and that also would be synonymous with the Hebrews. So you get this idea that the Jews Moses led the Jews out of Egypt, and then you get Jesus was ministering to the Israelites in the first century. These sorts of things, and they're used sort of interchangeably that way. You may assume that that's the case, but when you look at the actual evidence, when you look at the actual documents from these eras, these words are not used interchangeably. They're not used synonymously, and so ultimately, you have to figure out what the difference in nuance is and why they're used differently. And the argument of this book is that Jew is a subset of Israelite. It specifically refers to the subset derived from the kingdom of Judah. which is why you get the term connecting to that. So basically, Jew means Judahite, and Judah is not the same as Israel. It's a subset of the 12 tribes of Israel from the biblical perspective, and from a historical perspective, it's a whole separate kingdom that sort of connected to and worships the same God as the kingdom of Israel, but they're separate entities. So for its part, Israel then is a larger category that then includes those associated with and descended from the northern kingdom of Israel who are not from Judah. So by definition, that means that there are non-Jewish Israelites throughout the biblical period and beyond, and that actually turns out to matter quite a lot. And then Hebrew, of course, is a third term that is consistently treated as a linguistic term in the Second Temple period. So that's sort of the first thesis of the book. And then the second thesis is, like unto it, or is related to it, which is that once we recognize that distinction between those two things, we can start to understand a lot of prophetic and restorationist texts a lot more clearly. When people are talking about when the prophets, promise the restoration of Israel, they're not just promising, some sort of Jewish independence in the future. They're promising something much larger than that involves the reconstitution of the full 12 tribe people and so on. And once we get into that, we can start to understand a lot more.
Excellent.
That's really good. As you talk, you remind me of a story of when I was at my previous job before I started teaching modern Hebrew at university. I was telling one of my coworkers, "Hey, I'm going to go teach modern Hebrew. That's where my new job is going to be." And he said, "Oh, interesting. Is that the language that Israelites speak today?" And
Israelites versus Israelis, yeah,
right. And I had to tell him, "Well, close, but no cigar. Israelis." And he felt really embarrassed. But one thing I'm really curious about is I think as you talk, we might think, oh yeah, I'm not super educated. I don't know a lot about, whether it's the Middle East today or, I'm not really into the weeds of biblical research. But how did scholarship get to the point where they didn't see this distinction?
Yeah.
I'm really curious, as you were doing research, how did scholarship get to the point where it was before you did your own research?
Yeah.
That's almost too much for one podcast episode. But, what you're dealing with is, and this is part of what the first part of the book addresses, is you're dealing with, anytime you're talking about Israel, the term Israel or Israelite, you are dealing with a theological, with a very contested theological territory. Throughout history, there has been a lot of effort from different groups to claim that term and its covenantal characteristics, the implications that it carries, that Israel is the people of the specific God of Israel, that there's been efforts by different groups to claim that title or that category as their own. And you see this as far back as, you go all the way back into the time of, David and Solomon and so on. And you have the distinction between Judah, Judah and Israel are fighting over this stuff back in, when David crosses over the Jordan, and then, they're going to bring him back after the death of Avshalom, or when Absalom wins over the hearts of Israel. If you read that whole narrative carefully, he wins over the hearts of the people of Israel, not so much Judah. Judah was sort of dad's power base, and only once he wins over the people of Israel does he kind of start to get that aspect. Well, when David's side wins, essentially, and he's getting ready to cross over, the Israelites and the people from Judah start to fight with one another over who gets to bring him back first. Well, it goes back pretty far then. And then you get into the Second Temple period, and you've got the people who still remain in Samaria, and you've got the people who return from the exile in Babylon to Jerusalem and all of this, and there's still squabbles between those groups, and each of them claims that Israelite heritage. And then beyond that, you get to early Christians who say, well, as far as early as Justin Martyr saying, well, we are the true heritage of Israel. And then you get the rabbinic movement and other Jews who do not hold to that notion that say, no, we actually have that. And then you have the continued existence of Samaritans who are looking at both of them going, guys, we here at Gerizim are actually doing we're really continuing that. So you've got these different groups that are all claiming Israelite heritage, but it eventually, the bigger groups, you get, Judaism and Christianity sort of compete in this regard, each laying claim to the heritage of Israel in different ways. And over time, you get, Christians sort of get more, even though there's that claim of, well, we are the, Veris Israel, we are the true Israel that gets put in there. You get more of the identification as Christian becomes kind of the label for that group. And then Jews tend to hold on to Israel as the primary label that defines sort of their covenantal status. And then that just sort of works its way through history. And then by the time you get to the 20th century, you get scholars that are trying to explain when they look at these ancient documents, well, why are these terms not used interchangeably? And you get, and this is, in chapter 1 of the book, modern 20th century scholarship basically has taken its explanation from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, or the Theologische Wörterbuch, the German version of that was done in the 1930s, that explains how these terms relate. And you have an avowed Nazi scholar who explains that, well, they basically mean the same thing, but, Jew was kind of a derogatory outsider, kind of insulting term that they used as a, accommodation to outsider use, whereas Israelite was the, beloved insider name that they preferred when dealing with each other. I mean, of course, that's the way it is. But none of the evidence from antiquity actually says that. It just so happens that that's exactly how those terms functioned in, 1930s Nazi Germany. If you wanted to refer to if you wanted to insult someone in the 30s in Nazi Germany, calling them a Jew would actually be insulting. Versus, if you wanted to show someone respect, you use the term that identifies them with the covenantal people, the Israelitische Gemeinde, so the Israelite community. And so this then just kind of became the assumption. We tend in scholarship to rely on those who came before us, and if we don't go back to the texts themselves and really make sure that those who came before us read them carefully, then it gets really easy to just carry forward some of those mistakes. And I think that's kind of where things stood before when I started my research, essentially. Yeah, very good. I really saw that in your book, and I really enjoyed that. It's a good test case for hermeneutics, right? And showing how philosophical context, even in the modern period, matters. That we can actually read back into texts meaning that may not actually be there. And what you've done here is really good. Is it really unpacks the ancient texts within their ancient context to show us what it actually means. And so I found that to be an excellent part of your book. So thinking if we jump back, let's just jump back into sort of a pre-exilic moment in Israel, which is a lot of time, right? I mean, there's a lot of time in the pre-exilic era. So when we define Israel, and you sort of began to do that in your response there, if we define Israel in a pre-exilic state, how do we do it? What sort of meanings are there that matter? At least the primary meanings. Well, and that gets complicated because, I mean, we could be talking about biblical Israel, or we could be talking about whatever we can reconstruct of, historical Israel, whatever might lie behind the biblical text, of which I'm a little bit skeptical of how much we can actually get to in that respect. But biblically speaking, in the Bible, you have obviously the patriarch gets that label, or gets that name first. He wrestles with God, and then or with a man / God / angel, whatever, at Peniel, and he refuses to let him go until he gets blessed. And the guy says, "All right, look, you've wrestled with God and with humans and have overcome, and so you are no longer going to be called Yaakov or supplanter. You are going to be called Israel, which whatever that means, it's a little bit tricky in terms of etymologically what that actually means, but it's identified with overcoming and its connection with the deity. So he gets that title, and then of course he has his 12 sons and so on. And so from that point forward in the narrative, that's established in Genesis, you have the people of Israel, the children of Israel, the sons of Israel are the descendants of Jacob. Of course, it gets more complicated than that, because the moment that those descendants come out of Egypt, Israel is a mixed multitude. It's people that are, actual descendants, like, genetically, lineally from Jacob, along with, a variety of other people who came out with them from Egypt. And they're all brought into this covenantal relationship with God, which is when Israel becomes a people, as it were, in the Exodus narrative. And then that moves forward, and all of a sudden you get to Judges, and you've got sort of a loose connection of various tribes that the one thing they do seem to have in common is that they worship the God of Israel, though they all seem to also be worshiping other gods at different points. And, that becomes a point of problem within the narrative. And that develops into then sort of the monarchical period, where you have very clearly, by that point, you have, the southern Judah group, and then the northern Israel group. And as far, if you read the biblical narratives carefully, what happens is essentially Judah under David essentially takes control of the north, and they become unified. But really, Israel is getting taxed in ways that Judah is not. And, it looks like a pretty, tenuous connection. But Judah becomes a part of Israel in that sense. They become unified with them, and you get this, again, tribal thing. Then, of course, Israel splits off. They're not happy with being overtaxed under David, and especially Solomon, so they go and they do their own thing. Before long, they get exiled, or you get the 8th century is just basically a massive disaster for the whole region. That kingdom gets destroyed. Large portions of them get exiled. Other people move in. Judah survives, and Judah tries to, as far as we can tell, reestablish a sort of greater Israel again under Hezekiah and Josiah and so on, and it doesn't really work. And then they get exiled by the Babylonians. And then there are all these prophetic promises that Israel, this greater Israel idea, is going to be brought back by the God of Israel, that he's going to restore them, and that they're actually going to be those through whom God governs the world and brings peace and justice and so on. So this is sort of the biblical picture that you get of pre-exilic Israel that moves into the exilic period and beyond. And, all of that ends up being, carried forward in sort of the stuff that I'm working in this book. Now, if we want to get into, pre-exilic actual history, there's other things there. Andrew Tobolowsky has some very interesting stuff that was just put out within the last couple of years as well, where he's arguing that, the whole notion of Israel as this 12-tribe thing is actually an exilic creation based on a pre-exilic people that we don't really have any way of reconstructing much about, and, tries to get into some of the backstory on that. And again, there's only so much we can know historically, but as far as the biblical story, that's where things sort of stand.
Yeah, it's very good. I think on the biblical level, especially because, it shows even in Exodus how you do have, you have Exodus 4:22, Israel is my firstborn son, which gives sort of a special meaning to the term even there, going back to the patriarchs, of course, following the promise through Abraham. But then, as you said, coming to Exodus 19 and 20, we give the covenantal relationship that happens, and we have a nation of Israel then at that point. So very differing terms even there in the book of Exodus, but of course moving forward from there. So it's very good to sort of parse that out on a biblical level.
Something I'm curious about, I think our listeners will be too, is you already mentioned how once we get past the exile, things become a little complicated, and they've been very misunderstood. Because we have, scholarship. There's a scholar who had an idea and everyone just kind of assumed it, and it became the axiom in the field. You're going back to the ancient sources. Can you kind of walk us through what are the people groups And what are some of the ancient texts? Now, you mentioned a lot of them. I know you can't just list them all here, but how does one go about saying, hey, I want to look at the original primary sources of that, we'll just loosely say Second Temple Jewish period, to figure out how are the people of this time period referring to these people groups? What does that process look like?
Yeah, and again, it is complicated, and there's a lot. So, I mean, in terms of the various groups, I mean, the most important groups are, obviously different groups of Jews. You've got Jews in the land, you've got Jews in the diaspora, you've got, a variety of Jews about whom we have, a decent amount of data. And then you also have Samaritans. And that's the one that, I sort of dinged the field a little bit for in saying, like, look, I mean, there's a lot of Samaritan stuff that we've got, and there's at least a lot of references to the Samaritans, even if we don't always have primary sources from the Samaritans, which we do have some, and we've got even more archaeological evidence. And the Samaritans in all of these things, not in all of these cases, in no case do they actually identify as Jews, and yet they've been treated as a subset of Judaism. And it's one of those, like, well, if we're going to treat them as they actually claim themselves to be, then we can't actually identify them as such. They claim to be Israelites, but not Jews. And then, of course, you've got, John chapter 4, where, Jews do not have dealings, or Jews do not have common, do not keep in common with Samaritans. Well, that's a big statement. That means that Samaritans are not understood as Jews. And yet Samaritans identify as Israelites. So now we've got two categories, two groups that we really need to pay attention to. And then, of course, you've got Christians later that claim the heritage of Israel as well. So that's a third group in this period. And then, of course, you've got other Israelites and Jews, in the diaspora. There's very limited evidence for, say, northern Israelites in the diaspora once you get into the Second Temple period, but there's none. There is a little bit that we see. I mean, even in the there's some Assyrian records, for example, that have chariot commanders and that sort of thing with Yah theophorics, which suggests that these are people that are of Israelite heritage. I mean, that's where you would get that most likely. So there's a little bit there. So those are your groups. And then if you're trying to understand how all this works, I think you basically have to get to working with, first and foremost, I'm more of a text guy, so I start with texts. But I think you have to keep in mind also whatever archaeological data and evidence you have in that, and you constantly going back and forth and looking at, okay, how does this relate to that? But for me, you've got these various corpora of texts within the Second Temple period, and you want to look at how each one is using these terms. And you have to consider each text on its own terms. And then once you've done that, you start to look at, okay, are there commonalities? Is there any set of common threads, or is there one common thread that works through these various resources, these various texts? And so for me, places like Flavius Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, you've got the whole Dead Sea Scrolls corpus, which is, voluminous. You've got the various, they're often labeled apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, these different texts. And, there are hundreds of these texts, and you go through and you work through exactly how each of those defines itself, how each of those is understanding these concepts, and you do it one at a time. You do it in each of these texts, and then only once you've considered it in those texts do you start to really try to make a more big picture, try to put the big picture together to see those commonalities. And that's basically what I did in this project.
This is one of my favorite parts of your research. The graphs in this book alone is worth the price of admission, seeing how you lay out these numbers. And, the humanities, stereotypically, it's often put in contrast to the sciences, and it's like, okay, if you're in the humanities, it's just all subjective. It's all interpretation. And while I understand, the sciences and humanities are definitely different, your research is a great example of getting as close as we can to data-driven research, where it's not just reading between the lines. You're creating actual data by which term is used to describe a certain people group in specific books, and when those books are trying to do certain things. And I think there's a lot that listeners would learn from reading all these different sections of your book. And for example, one of my favorite parts was actually reading about Tobit. I was surprised. I would not have guessed Tobit would be such a great resource for this conversation, and so fun. And you walk through all these different books. Did you have a favorite source by chance that as you were going through your research that you were just thought was especially fun or surprising that you included?
It might have
this?
been Tobit, actually. I think that probably was it, because Tobit is one of those. You look at it and it's such a smoking gun when you realize, like, oh wow, all of this research about Tobit talks about how, you have this Jewish family that's trying to maintain its identity in exile, and then you realize, like, wait, they're never called Jews. It never actually calls him Jew. Like, throughout the book, it only refers to him and his family as Naphtalites and Israelites. And it refers to him as a faithful Israelite. And, the difference between him and the other Naphtalites is that, he refuses to, worship the calves at Dan or worship at Dan or Bethel. And he actually makes the longer trek down to Jerusalem because he's pious and all of this. So, he's allied with the Jerusalem side of things. But he's always and everywhere a Naphthalite and always an Israelite. And, I love Amy Jo Levine, who does, tremendous, just great work. And some of her work on Tobit is just so delightful. And she's one of my favorite writers in the field. And she has this turn of phrase where, it works well. She says that, Tobit is, one of the main subplots of Tobit is that he's got to find a nice Jewish girl to settle down with, and this is obviously a play on what you'd get in modern English. You got to just find yourself a nice Jewish girl. Well, my observation is that if he had married a Jewish girl, it actually would have been as much a tragedy as anything else, because what this is about the maintenance of tribal identity, of maintaining Naphthalite identity, and he needs to marry another Naphthalite in order for this to be in order for God to preserve that tribe in exile. So it's not just about settling down with a nice Jewish girl. Well, if he marries a girl from Judah, that's not what the book is about. That's violating what the book is talking about. This is about God's preservation of Naphtali, the actual, specific tribe that's not Jewish and yet still Israelite. And that to me was just such a fun book to work through in that. And once I realized, I'm looking through and I'm, running numbers and, using different, I used accordance as my primary, for looking at a lot of these things. And, I'm plugging in like, okay, well, how many times does Jew or Jewish or, the various cognates of Judaios, how many times does that actually show up in Tobit? Oh, wow. None? Wow. Oh, wait. Okay. So you got this, you got the, I think Sinaiticus has one mention of Yehudim or Yehudaios in there where it's, and the Jews in Nineveh rejoiced or whatever. And it's not even about Tobit and his family. It's a separate group. And you go like, oh, wow. Like, oh. And then you start to read it a little bit differently. So that one was a really fun one. There were several, though, that were up there for me, but that might have been number one.
Yeah, I love that was your favorite too. That was mine. And I have to say, again, anyone reading the book, like those few pages on Tobit is just worth reading as an interesting commentary on Tobit in general, because again, this is just another example of the field. It's so common when people do, let's say, a course on the Apocrypha Deuterocanonical books, it's so easy to just use that typical Jewish language really quickly to briefly summarize the book when you realize, oh, that's not what this is. And that's what I had fallen under too. I just kind of assumed, okay, yeah. And then we realized, wait, it's not. A really quick one more follow-up question. I've had to break so
many habits for myself and learning and like unlearning so much of this in the process of this over the last 20 years. Yeah, I totally get that.
So one more quick follow-up question on Tobit, since we're here, that I was really curious about too, is this became a whole new interesting category of literature for me when you comment on the other dynamic that makes Tobit interesting is the idea of Jewish people writing stories about non-Jewish Israelites in the Second Temple period. So Can you maybe just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah.
That was just a bomb that you dropped on me there. And I was just like, what? This is like, good.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that, Tobit is almost certainly written by Jews, not by Northern Israelites. But, if you read the Hebrew Bible, large chunks of the Hebrew Bible are not actually talking about Judah or Jews. They're talking about Israel in the north. I mean, you go through the bulk of First and Second Kings, and more than half of it is dealing with the northern kingdom. I mean, the entire Elijah and Elisha cycle is in the north.
Yep.
I mean, that's, First Kings 17 through Second Kings 12? That's a big chunk.
It's a lot.
Right? And that's all in the north. I mean, the only time you see the south involved is like, Jehoshaphat was there, and, he said, hey, is there, not a prophet of Adonai that's here? So, that's fascinating, because this is literature that is preserved by the remnant of the southern kingdom of Judah. There's no question about that. We know this.
Yeah.
And yet, so much of it is focused on northern patriarchs, northern tribes, the events in the north. Now, in many cases, it's to sort of demonstrate that, those northerners, they didn't do this right, and that's why. But, it's all set up in a way that Judah is not complete without what's going on, without its northern complement. And you get this even in the end of Genesis. I mean, that was another actually sort of big thing for me to realize, like, wait, you've got the last 13 chapters of Genesis, 37 through 50, or I guess that's 14. You got, that last whole chunk of Genesis is about the northern patriarch Joseph.
Mm. Yeah.
With the little exception of that chapter 38, which is, that ribald story that doesn't really make Judah look the best, right? And it's like, wait a second, Genesis, this is a book that it's preserved in the Jewish Bible, as it were. But the patriarch that it's talking about here is not the patriarch of Judah. And the one who gets the double portion, who becomes the inheritor in line with the primary inheritor, is not actually Judah. Judah gets to be the ancestor of the leader, until Shiloh comes to that whole passage that in chapter 49 that's really a mess in Hebrew. Exactly what that means in the manuscript history is tricky. But what's happening there? Well, yeah, he gets, there's going to be a ruler that the scepter will be with Judah, but the inheritance, the double portion, is Joseph, who gets Ephraim and Manasseh. And this sets the stage that, Joseph is really sort of the center of Israelite inheritance. And that's not what you'd expect with a text that's transmitted by and, preserved by Jews from the South in this whole period. And you get this throughout. And then you get to something like Tobit, written by Jews about Israelites in exile. And you say, like, well, what's going on here? And then you realize that when you read Jeremiah and Isaiah and these prophetic figures that are so influential within the canon and beyond, they're promising that when Israel is scattered and, in advance of Judah being exiled, they're saying this is a temporary punishment to God's people. And this is going to be reversed, and God is going to demonstrate himself faithful by redeeming and restoring all of this group, including the north.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. If you hold to that, if you continue to think that those prophets were speaking the truth, and that your God, who is the God of Israel, throughout all of these sources, he's the God of Israel, not the God of Judah. Which is interesting. You see this often in modern scholarship. You hear Jewish God, the God, et cetera, et cetera. You don't get that terminology in any of this text. And I'm not the first person to point that out. That was pointed out, in the 50s by actually an Israeli scholar. But it's consistently the God of Israel. Well, if that's what I believe, and if I believe this God is going to be faithful, then I have to continue to believe that Israel like in the larger sense, is going to come back. Otherwise, these prophets got it wrong. And if they got it wrong, then is my God really who I think he is? So this is where I think something like Tobit is exactly the sort of thing that Southerners are going like, where are they? Like, what about Naphtali? What about these? And then you have somebody go, okay, well, let me tell you, God has actually preserved them out there. There still is a faithful remnant. We may not see them. They're out there way east or whatever, but God has preserved them for these last days. And at some point, God is going to redeem and restore his whole people, of whom he's maintained a remnant throughout. And that part ends up being really important to Judaism, because without it, the faithfulness of God is actually called into question. The faithfulness of the God that Jews worship is called into question if that God is not also preserving that northern portion, of whom the prophets made a lot of major promises.
Yeah. That's so good, and I think you're making such a nice maybe argument even for the actual history of ancient Israel, because it does show how these southern tribes are actually putting forth the whole history of Israel, the northern tribes as well, saying that, salvation will come forth. You might not expect that if history wasn't true in that sense. But I want to divert away from that. I want to ask you a question regarding your erudition out of the Gospel of John. You brought up John chapter 4 with the Samaritan. So there's this, reading your book, I couldn't help but to think of this chapter often, and especially this verse, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Because ultimately Jesus is going to suggest that there's a time coming when we won't worship in Jerusalem or in Samaria, right? And on either of these two mountains. And so you have verse 22, though, where he says, "You worship what you do not know," saying this to a Samaritan. "We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." So you see here that there is an interesting distinction being made even within Israel regarding this particular tribe. I'd love to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, I think this gets back to, if you read First and Second Kings, for example, you find that, David and Solomon had their issues. And, actually, if you get into it, not just David and Solomon, you go throughout the fact that the Judahite kings are actually offering their children in child sacrifice on the regular, that actually seems to have been a widespread practice by the Judahite monarchs. That's it's not exactly hiding it, but it's not emphasizing it in First and Second Kings, but it's there. So there's some aspect of that, but throughout you get this whole notion of the North, they've been in rebellion. You get when Rehoboam and the Rehoboam-Jeroboam split happens, you have that editorial aside. And so the 10 tribes have been in rebellion against the house of Israel, or against the house of David, to this day. And so what you have is in the a good way to put this is in the Jewish Israelite reading of this, in that theological understanding, David and David's house gets an everlasting promise. David is promised to be the one through whom the rule that God has promised is going to come. And David is from Judah. And I think Jesus is in John saying, look, the promise of redemption, the promise of salvation here, that's got to come through the Jews, because that's the promise that comes through David. He's identified, and I think, of course, this has extra weight coming out of Jesus' mouth in the Gospel of John, saying, the one through whom that salvation is supposed to come is standing in front of you, or sitting down with you. Salvation comes from the Jews, and I'm it, is what's happening in the Gospel of John, because Jesus is the heir of David, to whom those promises were made, and through whom the restoration of Israel and the salvation of Israel and beyond is actually promised. But I think that this ties into this larger notion of what I, following E.P. Sanders, call restoration eschatology, that I think is really central to early Judaism. And I think it's underplayed in how important it is in the Second Temple period, partly because once you get to Rabbinic Judaism, certain strands of Rabbinic Judaism, especially once you get into the modern period, have sort of de-emphasized the restorationist aspect of this. So that sort of has become less emphasized within some of the early Jewish sources. But if you read a lot of this early Jewish material, the expectations of a final redemption and a final exaltation of of the people of Israel is if not central, it's always there, pretty much always there. And so what I see is that this is sort of that other part, or that completion of when you're looking through the narrative that's established in, starting in Genesis and working its way through the primary history, and you get some revision of it in First and Second Chronicles, but throughout the prophets and all of this, you have this notion of God having the God of Israel being the God of the world, the high God, and having a specific plan through which the whole world will be redeemed. And he chooses one family, Israel, and then chooses one tribe and one family within Israel through whom that is going to, manifest its way out to Israel, and then through Israel to the world. And what I see in John when Jesus makes this statement is he's saying that it is Judah that is the center, the people through whom that salvific thing that God is going to do for all humanity. It's Judah that God has chosen, and specifically, he doesn't mention David there, but it's David and David's family through whom that's going to be done, and then that's going to spill over to the rest of Israel and beyond. I think that is the theology that's sort of underlying what's going on there in the Gospel of John.
It's fantastic. I think it's such a good response. And you see here, too, I think in John 4, obviously it is about where worship happens, at Mount Gerizim or in Mount Zion in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem temple. And, of course, that was the sin of Jeroboam. The ultimate sin was that he did not worship at the Jerusalem temple, and that the northern tribes worshiped at different sites. Everything would have been fine had Jeroboam still been faithful in going to the Jerusalem temple, according to how Kings wants to work that out. So interesting here that Jesus is going to actually do away with all of that, say that we're not going to worship on either mountain anymore, but we're going to worship God in spirit and in truth. So I think it's a very interesting point on a historical, geographical level when it comes to what was the sin of the northern tribes ultimately and what wasn't. So,
it sort of
excellent.
cuts the Gordian knot to some degree in terms of the
certainly
rivalry
does.
between those groups, where it's like, Jerusalem or Gerizim, and he goes, well, it's going to come from the group in Jerusalem, but ultimately it's going to be, both and neither. That sort of is the way that works. I do wonder whether in that notion of worshiping in spirit and truth rather than on one or the other mountain connects to the vision of the temple that you get in Ezekiel.
Oh, interesting.
Because one of the things about the vision about the temple in Ezekiel is that that's not actually a place where, there's a whole lot going on in that temple. God is there and the presence is there, but what actually happens is the water just runs out from it, and then the water gets deeper and deeper the further away you get.
Yeah. That's interesting.
That's emanating from the temple, and you don't see, a whole lot of sin offering and that sort of thing going on in that temple, or a lot of the things that are happening. The expectation is that people really aren't going to be going to that temple so much,
right?
And it's going to be holy and sort of kept in a different way, and the water's going to run out. I do wonder to what degree, especially given the the statement that Jesus makes that later in the Gospel of John, to the one who has my word, living waters will pour out from him, right? As it is written, and this has always been a difficult thing of like, where is that written? Like, there's not actually a specific passage where it says, that people will have living water come out from them, but there is living water coming out from the temple in Ezekiel,
that's good.
In that particular way. And I wonder whether or not this is actually connected with that in a specific way within the Gospel of John.
Sounds like a good paper right there. So
that's really interesting. I'm so glad that we're getting to this point, this eschatological vision, because this is the part that everyone needs to hear. Because on one hand, your book is making sure we actually get our categories right, which ultimately this will influence so much research in a lot of fields, because this terminology and categorization of people, which then impacts whose ideologies are whose, is hugely influential. But the thing that you really focus in on toward the end is this really impacts what is the eschatological vision of the Jewish/Israelite, whatever, people groups. You've already kind of touched on that. So I guess I have a twofold question. One is there anything even more so than you've already said you want to dig into on that part of the vision? If you've already feel like you've touched on that enough, the other thing I want to ask you about is it's so hard to not then think about the Great Commission that Jesus gives with the intentionality of saying, go to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. I know growing up for me, that verse just might as well meant go to want, and then to the ends of the earth, right? So can you just maybe help us here?
Yeah, and that is, I certainly would have taken it the same way before too. I mean, it's want, because you hear Judea and Samaria, and we are, especially in the United States, we tend to be a people without a place. How many of us actually, especially in the sort of intellectual class, most of us don't actually end up living where we were born, or where we, where our people were, or whatever. I don't have a hometown. I mean, I've lived all over the place. So for me, the local aspect of a lot of things in the tradition and within the Scripture, that sort of thing, something I have to kind of change the way I think in order to think that way. And this is one of those. I mean, Judea and Samaria are significant here because, this is Judah, and Samaria is, of course, where the Joseph tribes are. But see, the Samaritans claim to be from the Joseph tribes, but what about the rest of the northern kingdom?
Right.
I mean, northern kingdom is not just Joseph and is not just Ephraim and Manasseh, right? So you've got to get to the rest. And the ends of the earth, of course, that language is borrowed from Deuteronomy, where Deuteronomy, and also from Leviticus, where Leviticus says, "Though I scatter you to the ends of the earth," right? This is at the end of I think it's Leviticus 26, if I remember right. But if you do not listen to me, I will multiply your punishment sevenfold, and so on, and then. Ultimately, there will be this redemption. Though I scatter you to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back from there. And then you get in Deuteronomy 30, I will regather you from the various places where I scattered you, from the ends of the earth. You get this language. So this is language that is absolutely pulling from this larger restoration eschatology of the 12 tribes connected to this notion of exile for disobedience to the covenant and the faithfulness of God to his people. That, again, where does salvation begin? To the Jew first, as Paul says, or Judea first, as Jesus says, and then Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. Well, you've got to go and get the rest of Israel from the ends of the earth. And Jesus, in a couple other places, he'll send his angels, his messengers, to the four corners of the earth to gather his people. This is all part of that tradition, and it's all coming out of this prophetic expectation that there is going to be a reversal of the curse of the Torah that Israel fell under for disobedience. That Israel disobeyed, and in Deuteronomy you have this. Moses says, see, I set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse, but I know you're going to choose death. So let me sing my song here. And the song of Moses comes out, and he gives this song about how you're all going to do this, and then God's going to redeem and restore you. This is what that's about. And there's no way of getting around that. That's what Jesus is talking about. That I argue, and so the next book that I have coming out, and it'll be coming out in the summer of 2023, that book is basically arguing that Paul, his entire gospel goes off of this point. Like, that's what he's arguing. And that's why when Paul goes to the nations, he sees that as his mission for bringing about the restoration of Israel. He's not just indiscriminately like, God's opened the doors for everybody because, God loves everybody. No, this is about God's faithfulness to his people, Israel. And what Paul does is he concludes, the bulk of Israel intermarried with and became ethnically indistinct from the nations. So how is God going to bring Israel back? Well, he's going to bring in the nations then. And this is how God's promise to bring about redemption to all through Israel is actually going to happen. So he actually sort of wraps all that up together. And I think this is utterly central to the earliest Christian gospel proclamation, is that this is all about God's faithfulness to Israel, and through Israel to bring justice and redemption to the whole world.
It's good.
That's so good. I mean, look, this already taps into what I mentioned earlier, that your research has huge implications moving forward for a lot of areas, including one that you're already tracking and following with that needs another book, the part 2, and seeing how this plays a huge role in the New Testament, and New Testament literature and theology. So I don't know if there's a place for pre-ordering this book or not. Not sure.
It will be soon. It's it just got sent to it's going to the project manager for copy editing now. And once we have a cover, which is, I've got the artwork selected for that, but we have to actually get the cover design and all that. Once that cover design is done, it'll probably be in January or February. Then that'll be available for pre-order shortly.
Fantastic.
Thereafter.
Well, once you all get the book, The Idea of Israel, we'll post on our social media, and we'll post on the podcast description. Let's blow up that pre-order and help him finish this seminal part, 2-part work. I know you mentioned in your book that this work doesn't stand alone, right? It's part 1 to this whole huge project that you're doing, and I totally see how you couldn't have done both in one book. It's just too much. Too much.
I actually tried. So the interesting thing was that this book was, and these 2 books were actually, I submitted them initially as a single book, and then I and the editor determined that the best way to go forward would be to split them into 2 for exactly that reason. Because I initially tried to do kind of I modeled this whole project off of Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which E.P. Sanders changed the field in with that book from 1977. And I looked at that and I was like, well, if I'm going to have any sort of comparable impact on some things that I think need changing in a similar way, then I'm going to do the same kind of thing. And it turned out it would be better to do it as a 2-book series rather than doing it as one. And I think that ended up being much, much better. The second book is way better as a result, because it would have been a very thin treatment of Paul and sort of tacked onto this.
Cool. Well, as we start to wrap up, Nathan, do you have any last question or comments for Jason?
I think one last question I have is, what's the consensus been from the scholarly world with putting this thesis out there? What's been the response?
So far, I've not gotten as much pushback as I expected.
Okay.
Given that this is obviously arguing for a paradigm shift, you're kind of waiting on, like, okay, who's going to really say no? There's just no way, and where is the pushback going to come from? So far, the response has been, a series of emails and other things of like, oh wow, like I think this is right.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to have to change this or that sort of thing. And there was just the Enoch seminar did an international panel early in December, so that was a couple weeks ago now, from when we're recording this, where there were some eminent reviewers. I was really pleased that they put some folks together to do a formal review of it there. And there haven't been any journal reviews yet, so I can't go off of those. But based on the feedback from those reviewers in the panel, the general consensus has been that this will essentially change the general paradigm of how we understand this in the field moving forward. There's going to be some pushback in the sense of, where are there some differences? Where are the outlier texts that take some different views, which inevitably is going to be brought out? I mean, Judaism and Israelitism, or Israelism as I label it in this book, it was by no means monolithic. So there's going to be more discussion of like, okay, is this particular reconstruction of what's going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, is that reading of that particular section of the scroll precisely right? That's where there's going to be some pushback, and there will be one of the reviewers in particular said, yeah, I'm not sure I follow, your reading of this particular scroll here. I think this scroll may be an outlier and taking a different view, but I think in general, I think your overall thing holds across the board for most things. It's just this one thing I have a little doubt about. And I think that's been kind of the general thought, is a little concern that it may be overly monolithic, which, I don't think it's monolithic either. And so getting some opportunities to flesh out some of the differences there. And I did not intend this, and I don't intend the second book to be the last word on anything. I'm trying really to lay the foundation for a lot of future work that can carry a lot of things forward, and we can understand, a lot of folks will understand things better than I do, building on that foundation.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised, because your book is so data driven that it's hard to disagree. And I also think you're doing a great, brave scholarship work, because one of the hunches I have for why this view has been propagated for so long is that it's so in vogue to just focus on one text or one section or one century. And I understand that, because we want to go deep and we want to master everything related to that. But if that's all we do, we never get the comprehensive 20,000-foot view. And the scary thing is you will have someone who is this specific scroll of the Dead Sea Scroll scholar, and that's all they do, right? And you mention that specific scroll, or someone is a Tobit scholar, and it's a lot easier to say, you know what, I'm going to choose the most narrow niche topic, only talk about that, I master that thing. But at some point, we have to have synthesis scholars, people who are saying, I'm going to look at the vast amount of literature. So thank you for doing that. That's a tough work. Yeah. And it makes sense why it takes so long to produce this type of work. I'm very excited. We don't have to wait long for your next book, by the way.
Thanks for writing that at the same time. That was excellent. Wonderful idea.
It's very J.R. Tolkien-esque, J.R. Tolkien wanted all those books to be put in one mega book, and the publisher's like, no, we can't. It's a massive book, man. We gotta space these out. So
it took me about as long to write these as it did him. So,
that's great. Well, before we go, let us know what's the best way if people want to connect, if people want to get your book, first and foremost, if people want to connect more with you and your content, what's the best way for people to do that?
Well, as far as getting the book, it's available, pretty much wherever books are sold, and, grab it from Cambridge University Press, or from Amazon, or from wherever, if you, prefer not to, add more money to Amazon, whatever. That none of that really impacts me all that much. I just want people to be able to interact with the ideas. Yeah. As far as getting in touch with me, I'm not hard to find. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, various social media. I'm going to be setting up actually some other things here in the future. I'm about to launch actually. This is something I've wanted to do for years, but I was not going to do until both books were done. I'll be launching a Bible and Bible adjacent themed podcast called the Bible Pod. I'll be doing that along with a YouTube channel for that. That's part of the plan for 2023, is to get that off the ground.
Excellent.
To try to take some of this. I mean, as you know, this book is dense, and there's a lot there. I want to actually take a lot of this and then a lot of other stuff and make it more accessible to people, whether that be people in the pulpit or in the pew or whatever, people who are not specialists. And that's something that, if you're listening to this sometime, after mid 2023, hopefully the Bible Pod and the various, things associated with that, which I'll probably have a TikTok and other things going along with that, will also be accessible. So
looking forward to that. So.
Well, we'll put links to all this in the description below and in the show notes. And maybe we'll have to have you on mid-2023 to talk about your new book and your new podcast and YouTube channel. So
looking forward to it.
Thank you again for joining us. Phenomenal work. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, guys.